I think we better try to get started. Welcome to Random Review. I'm Connie Georgiou, and along with Deborah Goldenberg in the back, I coordinate this program. I see once again we appear to have a sellout, which here means all the chairs are taken. So we're very happy to see you. The Random Review program is sponsored by Friends of the Library, and we have a few local sponsors. Northwest Graphic Imaging makes our beautiful posters, Trader Joe's donates our flowers, and Grassroots Bookstores donates books for our reviewers. If you have friends who aren't able to be here, the program will be made into a podcast and will be available on the library's website, as are all of our random reviews. I want to make one announcement. On Saturday, December 7th, is our annual holiday book sale. This is a wonderful sale. We have gift quality books that have been donated to the library. It'll be right in this room. We have fabulous prices. I don't think we have any prizes, but we have wonderful prices, and I know because I priced all the books myself. That's my other job here. So please come if you have time. It's going to be 10 to 4 on the 7th. Next month's review is another great one. It's Wednesday, December 11th. The book is The Swerve, How the World Became Modern by Stephen Greenblatt, and it's going to be reviewed by Paul Farber, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at OSU. Now, for today's program, Bonnie Brzozowski is here with us. She's a member of our Random Review Committee and one of the reference librarians in this library, and she's going to introduce our speaker today for Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher.
Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So today's reviewer, Larry Landis, is an archivist. And though I do not know Mr. Landis personally, there's actually a very special place in my heart for archivists. Some people may not realize it, but librarians and archivists, they usually attend the same graduate program, though our coursework may actually differ. And two of my dearest friends that I met in library school, and yes, even the aspiring archivists in my graduate program did refer to it as library school, they're now professional archivists. When I catch up with them, I usually find them buried in their collections, talking excitedly about some interesting marginalia they came across in a rare book, or perhaps busily digitizing some old photographs. They find delight in the old and the dusty, the yellowed edges, the promise of historic revelation that exudes from each unopened box of papers. I'm also always fascinated by the stories they share of their archival coups. I don't know if you realize it, but many archivists are not passive players in the game of historic preservation. Some actually pursue collections of prominent community members, organizations, authors, musicians, and even photographers. They relish the hunt, and then they revel in the spoils. Being a former history major, I cannot tell you how romantic all of that ends up sounding to me. I'm awed by people so dedicated to preserving the historic record. For me, archivists are the ultimate truth seekers. The collections they devote themselves to capture history so much more accurately than some of the stuff you can read in the history books. So my point is that Mr. Landis's profession is quite dear to me, and his excellence within it makes him a most suitable reviewer for our random review today. He was appointed to the position of the director of the OSU Library's Special Collections and Archives Research Center in 2011, and he was university archivist there prior to that, beginning in 1996, but he's been with the university since 1991. Mr. Landis is a member of the Oregon Encyclopedia Editorial Board, the Oregon Digital Newspaper Program Advisory Board, the Benton County Historic Resources Commission, and the Oregon Century Farm and Ranch Program Committee. He recently completed 9 years on the Oregon Historical Records Advisory Board. In 2007, he was a recipient of an Oregon Heritage Excellence Award. Historic photography has been one of Larry Landis's areas of interest and expertise throughout his archival career. He worked as the photographs archivist for the Barker Texas History Center, which is now the Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin. He worked with photos ranging from Texas's Republic period all the way to the late 20th century, and he even organized the Russell Lee Photograph Collection of more than 25,000 images, representing Lee's documentary work from the late 1940s into the late 60s. While at the University of Texas, he became familiar with the work of Edward S. Curtis, our subject here today. The center's holdings included a set of Curtis's The North American Indian. So let's welcome Larry Landis.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was a very glowing introduction. Hopefully I can live up to it. I will take one exception, and that's with the dusty materials. Yes, some materials do come to us dusty, but that is one of the things that we remedy immediately is to... we have this stereotype, of working with dusty materials, and it's true up to a point, but if you come visit the Special Collections and Archives Research Center, I think you will find that our collections are actually quite clean. Yeah, there's a little bit of dust on the boxes, perhaps, although I think we have good HVAC. But enough about that. Thank you all for allowing me to talk to you today. Edward S. Curtis is I won't say one of my favorite subjects, but certainly a subject that I've had a long interest in. As Bonnie mentioned, becoming first acquainted with his work when I was at UT Austin and reveling in the set of the North American Indian that we fortunately had in our holdings there. Well, for today's discussion, I'd like to talk about some of the key points in the book, and as I'm doing that, I'll have some selected images from the North American Indian. Many of them are images that Timothy Egan actually included in Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher. I also want to end with a brief discussion of an Oregon photographer who was directly influenced by Curtis. That's kind of beyond the scope of the book, but I think it's still worth discussing that overall influence that Curtis had within photography in the United States. If you have questions, my preference is that you ask questions during the presentation. I figure that if you have a question, it's best answered when you think of it, not because you will forget it necessarily, but I think that is the time to engage in the discussion about that particular point. So if I encourage you, if you do have questions during the course of the presentation, I'll do my best to look out on the audience to see the raised hands. And of course, there will be time at the end for additional questions. How many of you have actually read the book, Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher? Okay, so about a third of you. That's good. How many of you have read other works by Timothy Egan? Even more. So some familiarity. So that kind of gives me a good starting point. As many of you know, Edward Sheriff Curtis is perhaps the most written about of American photographers. He's been described as iconic, a racist, a romantic, a genius, and much more. Writer Timothy Egan's 2012 work, Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher, The Epic Life and Immortal Photographs of Edward Curtis, is a valuable addition to the corpus of scholarship about Curtis that includes dozens of books, countless journal articles, and exhibits, both online and analog. Egan's book is one of the most engaging works about Curtis, focusing in detail on the massive documentation project, the North American Indian, that consumed nearly 30 years of his adult life. The work is published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt of Boston and New York. It includes an extensive index. Including that index, it's 370 pages long, and includes a modest number of black and white photographs strategically placed throughout the work at the end of each chapter. And as you can see, the cover is beautifully designed. I think that makes it very appealing right off the bat. And for those of you with Kindles and other ebook readers, it is available as an ebook. So who is Timothy Egan? He's an award-winning columnist and author, and a graduate of the University of Washington. He's worked for the New York Times as a reporter and a columnist, and was a co-recipient of a 2001 Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times series, How Race is Lived in America. Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher is Egan's 7th book. An earlier work, The Worst Hard Time, The Untold Story of Those Who Survived the Great American Dust Bowl, won a 2006 National Book Award, which is considered to be one of the nation's highest literary honors. It also won a Washington State Book Award. That particular work resulted in Egan being prominently featured in Ken Burns' 2012 documentary on the Dust Bowl. Perhaps some of you saw that on Oregon Public Broadcasting. Among his other books are The Big Burn, Teddy Roosevelt, and The Fire That Saved America, which I understand was the subject of an earlier random review, and I'd also like to put up a plug for it for those of you that have not read it. I highly recommend it. I read it last summer right after I completed reading Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher, and I was reading it at a time when there were a number of large fires raging in the western U.S., so it really spoke to me in that regard, the power of wildfires and the destructive force and how they can change nature. Another previous work was Lasso the Wind, Away to the New West, and The Good Rain, Across Time and Terrain in the Pacific Northwest, which won a 1991 Pacific Northwest Booksellers Prize. Although Short Nights contains substantive information on Curtis's life, it's not a biography. It's not a picture book either, though it does include, as I indicated, a small number of photographs. Rather, this book is a detailed account of Curtis's monumental photo documentation project that became the 20 volumes of the North American Indian. Egan's work is certainly scholarly, though not in the traditional sense. The book contains neither footnotes nor endnotes, but rather an extensive chapter-by-chapter list of sources for key facts. What sets this book apart is Egan's meticulous and skillful focus on relationships, the relationships that Curtis built with people who were able to open doors for him, with people in power and with money, and most importantly, with the Native American communities and individuals. Egan also includes the relationships that failed, particularly though with Curtis's family, as they are key to the story. Egan also uses chapter titles that capture the essence of the forthcoming narrative. For instance, chapter 6 is titled In the Den of the Titan, which refers to Curtis's visit to J.P. Morgan, seeking funding for his project. Chapter 1, appropriately titled First Picture, opens with events leading up to Curtis photographing Kikasoblu, the daughter of Chief Seattle, who was also known as Princess Angeline. She was in the twilight of her life, eking out an existence on the shores of Puget Sound. By 1896, Curtis was already a successful photographer in Seattle, called by one newspaper the leading photographer in the Puget Sound. But these first pictures of Princess Angeline would change the course of Curtis's career in just a few short years. And I'd like to read you a passage from chapter 1 that I think captures the essence of Curtis's photography of Princess Angeline. When Curtis saw Angeline moving along the shore, the visible, nearly dead, using that cane of hers more like a blind woman trying to find her way than an old lady struggling for balance, she looked at once like the perfect subject. There against the deep waters of Puget Sound, there with the snow-mantled Olympic Mountains framed behind her, there with the growl of earth-digging machines and the snorts of steamships and loading crews and the clatter of streetcars and trolleys, with all of that, Curtis saw a moment from a time before any white man had looked upon these shores. He saw a person and nature one and the same in his mind, and they belonged. A frozen image of a lost time. He must take that picture before she passed. Egan compares Princess Angeline's twilight in life to that of Curtis's adolescence and young adulthood, perhaps subtly suggesting that they were kindred spirits. Egan writes, quote, "What Angeline did to stay alive, the grubbing and foraging and digging and cutting, was what Ed Curtis had done in his early years," end quote, because of a father who suffered from what we know today as PTSD, the result of several long years serving in the Army as a chaplain during the Civil War. By age 14, Curtis had to support his entire family. Curtis paid Angeline $1 for sitting during which this particular photo was taken, and paid her for other photographs that he took of her. She died soon after this photo was taken. Some felt that her death was the end of the Indian presence in the Northwest. For Curtis, Angeline was the start of the largest, most comprehensive photographic project in history. After Princess Angeline, the next key relationship that Curtis developed was with George Bird Grinnell, the founder of the Audubon Society, whom he rescued on Mount Rainier, along with Clint Merriam, co-founder of the National Geographic Society. This occurred in about 1898. So imagine rescuing these two icons of American culture. In Chapter 2, Egan recounts the developing friendship of Curtis and Grinnell and how Grinnell and Merriam were fascinated by Curtis's Indian photos. And another quick reading. This is Curtis talking to both Grinnell and Merriam. "Good pictures," Curtis explained, "are not products of chance, but come from long hours of study. Though he'd gone many times to Rainier, much of the mountain had eluded him as a subject. He said it could take years to get it right, years when he might return from the glaciers empty-handed. You had to understand the essence of the thing before you could ever hope to capture its true self. And yes, he was trying to bring a painterly eye to the process, a subjective artistry. No reason to apologize. He believed that no two people could point a camera at something and come away with the same image. But of course, photography involved a mechanical side as well, and there too you could shape the final product to match a vision, to bring the right image to light from a stew of chemicals, to touch it up in a print shop, to finish with an engraving pen. Curtis never turned it off, never took time to play or let his mind roam, even at home. Chapter 3 continues to build the relationship between Curtis and Grinnell. Curtis joined him in Montana in the summer of 1900 to spend time among the Blackfeet Nation peoples. During this trip, Egan describes Grinnell as being, quote, both mentor and tormentor to Curtis. Quote, Grinnell encouraged Curtis, urged him to be expansive, but also stripped him of his more romantic notions, end quote. The trip was the, quote, testing of an idea starting to take shape, that those Curtis Indian fragments sold by his studio could form the part of a much bigger picture story, end quote. In the Blackfeet, Curtis found, quote, a community of Indians to cast in lasting light on his camera glass, end quote. A community that he had been seeking ever since his encounter with Princess Angeline 4 years earlier. Grinnell taught Curtis a valuable lesson that he carried forth in much of his work. Take the time to get acquainted with members of the tribes before taking photos. Using this strategy, Curtis was allowed to take photos of the Blackfeet tribal members if they agreed and if Curtis paid them. Curtis heeded this lesson and used this strategy over and over. Chapter 4 tells us of the relationship that Curtis built with Chief Joseph and the University of Washington faculty member Edmund S. Meany, and the role that Meany played in assisting Curtis. And particularly humorous is Egan's account of Chief Joseph attending a University of Washington football game in 1903. By 1904, the Indian Project had begun to consume Curtis, and his family saw little of him, and he only talked of the project. Curtis visited Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 at the Roosevelt Summer Home on Long Island, invited by the president to photograph his children. Egan describes in Chapter 5 the growing relationship between the president and Curtis. Like Grinnell's advice on relationship building with the Blackfeet, the president instructed Curtis to get to know his children first. And of course, the president and Curtis shared stories of their Western experiences. Curtis had another motive with the visit. He needed a benefactor to underwrite his project, as the Smithsonian had rebuffed him in 1903. Curtis won the president's support, but TR could not find a benefactor to support Curtis's work. In Chapter 6, Egan describes how Curtis convinced financier J.P. Morgan to back his project. Curtis is probably one of the few people in the early 20th century United States who could claim Teddy Roosevelt as a friend and J.P. Morgan as a benefactor, given that T.R. and Morgan shared no love for one another. Egan, in his book The Big Burn, describes a contemporaneous relationship, but one with a different outcome. Gifford Pinchot was also a close friend of Roosevelt, but was absolutely despised by Morgan. Curtis visited Morgan in January 1906. After initially being turned down, Curtis opened his portfolio and showed him some of his best work. Curtis finally showed him this particular photograph, and with that, Morgan agreed to $75,000 over 5 years. With financing in place at the end of Chapter 6, the next several chapters are devoted to Curtis's major photography expeditions and the team that he built using Morgan's money, which included Smithsonian ethnologist and Indian scholar Frederick Webb Hodge and Curtis's wife's cousin, Bill Phillips. Some of the trips included a visit to the Apache in 1906. Curtis would visit and photograph the Apache on numerous occasions. The Sioux in 1907, which included a careful analysis and reinterpretation of the Custer story. And Chapter 9 recounts how Curtis approached this delicate subject. And the various Columbia River tribes in 1910. Interspersed among these chapters, Egan describes the process of getting the first volumes published and sold, as well as the technical perfection that Curtis sought. Egan also addresses Curtis's failing relationships with his family, especially his wife and mother. He writes that Curtis admitted to having a mistress, an insatiate one at that, and that mistress was the North American Indian. Epilogue to that. Claire Curtis filed for divorce in October 1916. In Chapter 12, Egan recounts the public presentations given by Curtis. One particular lecture series called The Story of the Vanishing Race. These shows were spectacles that included hand-colored lantern slide images dissolving into one another. They were supplemented with motion picture film footage that Curtis had shot and an orchestra playing an original score, quote, inspired by the recordings of Indian songs and chants that Curtis had brought home on his wax cylinders. We think of Curtis as a photographer, but with this particular project, he also made thousands of recordings on wax cylinders and shot thousands of feet of motion picture film. Really a complete ethnographic package. Obviously the photos are front and center, but this other material was almost as equally important. Curtis's venture into a full-length motion picture film, In the Land of the Headhunters, was a critical success when it opened in December 1914, but it ended up being a financial failure due to disputes over distribution. He ended up selling all the rights to the film in 1924 for $1,500. The total cost of producing it in 1913 and 1914 had been more than $75,000. Egan devotes an entire chapter to the story behind the film. The years 1916 to 1922 were not productive for Curtis, in part because of his failed family relationships. The Curtis's divorce took 3 years to settle, and Clara ended up with the studio. Egan calls this time period the Lost Days. And there's a very, very interesting account of some of the employees of the Curtis studio, including one of his daughters, basically trying to get as many negatives printed and moving as many negatives out of there before Clara Curtis took possession of the studio. But the book indicates that many of the glass negatives that were moved to the basement of a nearby building were ultimately destroyed, and we don't quite know why. It's very unfortunate. Conversely to the Lost Days, 1922 to 1927 was a productive period that Egan titles Second Wind. Curtis had moved to California, and his daughter Beth ran their new studio in Los Angeles. He was able to resume his work on the project, in particular among the California tribes. His last trip on the project was Alaska in 1927, a place he had visited as part of an expedition in 1899, and unfortunately an expedition that led to a lifelong rift with his brother, Esahel. This is one of the images from the Alaska trip, which is also the final book in the North American Indian, Volume 20. I think this is a very appropriate ending image to include looking to sea. I think it's very, very analogous to Curtis looking out, looking forward. As you can see, this is a hand-colored image, very beautiful. Another reason I wanted to include this was as a tribute to my late colleague and friend, Deanna Kingston, an anthropologist at OSU who passed away within the past couple of years. Her ancestral home was King Island, and she spent the bulk of her career at OSU researching her ancestral home. And I'm sure she walked this particular location. Egan's book concludes with an epilogue section that explains how Curtis's work was rediscovered in the early 1970s and quickly became the subject of many photo books. But perhaps more importantly, Egan describes how Curtis's work is being used today by tribal communities to reconnect with their past, a past that in many cases was forcibly removed from them. The Hopi tribe purchased an original edition of Volume 12 and used it to, quote, solidify its teachings, traditions, and language. The Hopi found the alphabet and the accompanying song lyrics crucial tools in teaching words that nearly disappeared, end quote. The popularity of Curtis's images in the 1970s and 1980s also produced a critical backlash. Yet modern appreciation of Curtis by critics and in Indian country and the rise in financial value of his photography throughout the world did prompt an inevitable backlash. Starting in the 1980s, a handful of academics and revisionists complained that Curtis's subjects were not authentic, that he had posed them and sometimes asked them to change from their everyday overalls and collared shirts into buckskin leggings and war bonnets. They said Curtis dwelled too much on the past. Where were the pictures of hunger and privation on the reservation? Why not show Indians in school or in office? Why not show them receiving handouts? Curtis had heard these objections during his lifetime, and he pled guilty to all, with a shrug. His goal was to capture Native people as they were before their cultures were too diluted. For more than 30 years, his main concern and competitor in this project was time itself. As he said often, every day meant the passing of some person who held knowledge that might disappear entirely. Near the end, he feared that most of the Indian world would eventually look as Oklahoma did to him in the 1920s, a people utterly remade by others. Egan captures the contemporary sentiment in Indian country about Curtis's work by quoting Kiowa writer N. Scott Momaday. Quote, "Taken as a whole, the work of Edward Curtis is a singular achievement. Never before have we seen the Indians of North America so close to the origins of their humanity, their sense of themselves in the world, their innate dignity and self-possession." End quote. Egan succeeds on many levels with Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher. It is a compelling adventure, yet meticulously researched. Although the focus is on Curtis's photographs, he articulates the importance of the 10,000 sound recordings and substantive motion picture footage that Curtis created. As I mentioned, essentially a complete ethnographic package. The book is appropriate for both serious scholars of Native American history and ethnography, as well as the casual reader looking for a compelling adventure. I highly recommend the book. And I would like to add my own epilogue. Curtis undoubtedly influenced his contemporary photographers nationally and internationally, and in many ways is still influencing photographers. One particular Oregon photographer, already well known for both his landscapes and his photographs of Columbia Plateau Indians, was particularly influenced by Curtis. Benjamin A. Gifford, trained as a photographer in Kansas, relocated to Portland in 1893. In the late 1890s, he moved his studio to the Dalles, though he maintained a strong connection to Portland. Though he had an established studio, he also worked as an itinerant photographer. As such, he visited many tribal communities in central and eastern Oregon and likely southeast Washington. Gifford took many fine photographs of Indians, but most were clearly made in a studio setting. In 1905, Gifford likely viewed an exhibit of Curtis's Indian photographs at the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, and probably read newspaper reviews of the exhibit that described the long trips, separation from family, and plain hard work that Curtis endured in order to get the right photograph. In Oregon Then and Now, photo historian and collector Tom Robinson wrote that, quote, "Within the next 2 years, Gifford made his most famous Indian photographs using precisely the techniques described in the Curtis Review. Although he had been taking Indian portraits for years, the Lewis and Clark Fair marked change in Gifford's style of photographing Indians." And the Gifford images that I showed you are part of the collections at OSU. We're very fortunate to have, in some cases, the original negatives that Gifford created. And this is another one of the Native American images in the Gifford collection. So, the burning question, where can we see?
Larry, did Curtis leave any writings that talked about the nature of the Indians, their philosophies, or anything like that?
Well, actually, in the North American Indian, Curtis wrote most of the text, so a lot of what he compiled is certainly included in that. And there are additional field notes. Curtis's work is, some of the original work is scattered. There is some at the University of Washington. I think other repositories perhaps on the East Coast, but the actual volumes of the North American Indian, the narrative portion was written by Curtis himself, so I think that's probably the best source, and does go into a lot of detail about what you just mentioned there. Yes?
I think it's important to understand how the consuming interest in Curtis's work was to him. because through his years, I think there was, what, maybe 3 times where he had a near total physical collapse, physically, where he had to spend time, you know, in the downtown hotels where he would just spend, I don't know how much time it was now, where he just could not do anything until he regained his strength and attitude and to continue on. But he just never gave up, but it physically took a real toll on his physical being.
That's certainly true, and Egan describes some of those episodes in quite a bit of detail in the book. Yeah, Curtis was living in a downtown hotel for part of this time after he had moved out of his family home, and there certainly were episodes. I mean, let's face it, he was a workaholic and drove himself very hard, sometimes too hard, which resulted in some health problems. Though he did live into his 80s, so despite being a smoker too, so he was doing something right to have that kind of longevity. But yeah, I think the health issues certainly probably increased the length of time of the project. That and the funding, which always was a continual problem. J.P. Morgan and his heirs, I think, ended up investing about $250,000 in the project, and that was a modest portion of the overall total cost. So the rest of the money came from the subscriptions, from Curtis selling copies of the photographs. Basically, any revenue that came out of the studio went back into the North American Indian project. And that was the bone of contention, particularly with his wife. And in some ways you can't blame her. But it's unfortunate. Yeah.
Do you think that just not showing more modern pictures of the Indian kind of set back the idea that a lot of people still have, that they're kind of backward and never capable of being assimilated into the society?
Well, he did include some more contemporary.
What was the question?
The question was, by not including more contemporary photographs of Native Americans, was Curtis perpetuating, I don't want to say the myth, but perpetuating their backwardness and their failure to assimilate. Perhaps, though he did take some contemporaneous photographs in the latter part of the 1920s. So there is a body of work, but that wasn't his intent. Was to basically show the Native Americans prior to European contact. It was not about assimilation. It was about a time well before Euro-Americans were part of the picture, pardon the pun.
Does the film survive?
The film was restored. The film has been put back together. It was restored. Part of it was apparently I think the Smithsonian tried showing it in the 1940s, and because it was shot on nitrate base, which is highly flammable, part of it burned up. But apparently there is a restored copy available. I've not actually seen it, but I would imagine it is available on DVD today. I think we had one over there, then we'll get to you. Yeah.
Can you turn the lights up? Yeah, I was just going to do that. Thank you. In response to his remark, it reminds me of Emily Carr when she was trying to photograph and describe the totem poles before they were gone on British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a very similar mindset, I think. And another place to see Curtis's photos is at the Chihuly Museum next to the Space Needle. We just saw them 2 weeks ago there because Chihuly has a collection of them. And there's a wall as big as that brown wall filled with them.
Yeah.
About 12 by 12 inch.
Well, the University of Oregon libraries and the University of Washington libraries have complete sets of the North American Indian. That's why I included those. In fact, the University of Oregon library set, and for those of you who read the book will remember this, the University of Oregon library set is the set that had been owned by the Curtis family. They acquired that by purchase in 1993. There is a set 40 miles down the road. I don't know how accessible it is. I think there are some restrictions. It's probably somewhat fragile. But certainly the University of Washington. The bottom two are websites. The Library of Congress in the late 1990s created a website of virtually all of the plates that had been in the North American Indian. And then Northwestern University took that one step further and actually digitized the entire volume, so the narrative is there as well. So we had one right up here.
Yeah, comment, that film is available on Netflix. It may have been retitled and not said.
It was retitled. You're absolutely right.
Do you remember what the title
So
was?
what's it called?
I'll have to look it up. In the Land of the War Canoes.
In the land of what?
In the Land of the War Canoes.
War canoes.
In the Land of the War Canoes. Apparently the restoration work was done in 1973. They spent 7 years putting the film back together, according to Egan. Yep.
After I read the book, I was curious about access at the University of Oregon, so I looked it up on their website, and they really restrict it to researchers to see the actual copy, but there are, I think, a facsimile-like copy.
I know it's on they have a microfilm
Right,
copy.
that you can see it, and
Mhm.
you can go there, but you have to make arrangements. But the
Well, again,
actual one, no.
these volumes are 100 years old, and I think they would suffer from continuous handling, so I think that's part of the restriction. So, it's unfortunate, but I understand that. As archivists, we walk that fine line between preservation and access. Let's see. The person in the back there has been waiting a long time.
Well, my question was partly answered by the lady, but I couldn't hear her, how to get access to the set. How to get access to the set that's at the University of Oregon Libraries. I heard her say something about it, but we couldn't understand what she said.
Well, the restriction is access to serious scholars. And that's probably left open to interpretation, too, as to what a serious scholar.
I would suggest going to the website, the UVO library website, because they do have, not showings, but they do have some public access. So go to them, and they don't do it on a regular basis, but occasionally they do. So go to the UVO website.
Well, let's see. Back
You
there.
ever engage in political activity to seek better treatment of the Indians by the government?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? I only heard part of that.
Did he ever engage in political activity to seek better treatment for the Indians by our government?
He was too busy taking photographs. I think some of his work certainly resulted in some lobbying, but I don't think he was not directly an activist himself. I think he let others take care of that. That's not to say he didn't do some, but that was not his focus. Now you can ask your question.
What do other ethnographers of the American Indians and say about the accuracy of his photographs? In other words, he clearly was posing to people and trying to put them back into a time where they weren't currently living. But did he sometimes choose the wrong hairdo, the wrong clothes, the wrong ethnographic, the wrong appearance? What do other ethnographers say about the accuracy of his images? It might be a little bit of a minor detail, but how accurate are they? Are they way off sometimes?
I think you get a whole range of opinions from both historians and ethnographers. Egan makes it very clear that Curtis was very meticulous in his research, as much as he could do in recreating an accurate scene. So yes, they were posed, but Curtis did that based upon the best knowledge that he had. So yeah, there are probably some inaccuracies, but I would venture to say that he was probably right more than he was wrong on that account.
I just wondering if there's any, like, if you were interested in a particular image, if there was another opinion about that you could look at, about the accuracy of the pictures, that kind of comparison. You're not sure?
Probably. Well, Curtis took 40,000 Indian photographs, so yeah. I'm sure there are a lot of range of opinions, but well, the level of discussion on a particular image, I really couldn't tell you. Some of them probably do have that range of opinion. I'm not an ethnographer. That's not something that I have researched heavily. How's that for a non-answer? Any other questions? Yeah.
I kind of remember hearing that the photography process, the chemicals that he used caused quite a lung damage. And that was the health issue.
That's possible, but I think Curtis employed a lot of people in his studio. I'm not sure how much actual developing and printing he was doing himself. Certainly some. It's entirely possible that could have contributed to him. I think his smoking probably contributed more. I mean, he was. Egan says Curtis was a nicotine addict. So I think that probably combined with inhaling these chemicals certainly could have contributed to some of the health issues. Absolutely. The photographic process. Curtis was, the photographs that appear in the North American Indian are a photomechanical process called a photogravure. And Curtis didn't produce those himself. He contracted that out to companies that specialized in that particular process. They are still, I still consider them photographs in a certain sense. What Curtis would have been making were very specialized prints using a traditional photographic process, and often using a gold toning process or a platinum toning process. He called the gold toning process an orotone. In fact, I actually brought 3 Curtis prints along, 2 from my own personal collection and 1 from our holdings at OSU. What I did not bring along was a platinum print of one of the images in the North American Indian, primarily because I think the risk management folks would have at OSU would have screamed. It has a price tag on it of $10,000. So I decided to leave that one at OSU.
Are there any photographs of any of these volumes? I mean, did you see anything like that?
I tried to look for a photograph of a cover, and I couldn't find one. As I recall, the volumes are 2 parts. There's the narrative and plates that are about like so, and maybe that thick, but each of those volumes has an accompanying folio, which is quite large. So the folio prints, well, they're all very collectible, but the folio prints especially, given their large size. I mean, they're exquisite. What I brought along with me are images that have been taken from the narrative, sliced out of the narrative volumes. But when we're done with the questions, I'll haul those out. I found the two that I have. I found at antique stores and got a really good price for them. I knew what they were. So one I think I spent less than $50, and the other less than $100, and I'm sure they're worth probably 3 to 4 times that amount. Let's see, right here.
Yeah, you mentioned the oral stone, and then you mentioned the platinum. Briefly, what is that process?
Well, it's a finishing process that uses both. Well, in the case of the orotome, actually gold in the finishing chemicals, or platinum in the finishing chemicals, to give it a certain look. And
Kind of like a silver or something?
pardon?
Kind of like a silver that kind of...
It adds a certain patina to the images. As I said, if that one platinum print hadn't been worth 10 grand, I would have brought it along so you could see an example. But I thought otherwise. There was a question. Okay, right back there.
Do you happen to know if he ever got onto the Olympic Peninsula to do work with the macaw, the quilly?
Oh yes, yeah. There's a whole. Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, one of the volumes includes a section on the macaw. So yeah, the coastal Indians, both in Washington and even into British Columbia, were widely photographed. Yes, sir.
How many times did he spend time with the Blackfeet? Many years?
It was multiple times. I don't recall right off the top of my head how many, but it was certainly the Blackfeet peoples were one of the communities that he developed a strong bond with. Hopi were the same way, and a couple of others. And for some of them, he returned many times, both to take new photographs, and I think to maintain relationships, and also just to see how much had changed over time in those communities. In some cases, it was pretty drastic. Well, I can haul out my 3 images if you want to see some originals. Thank you. I think so that they're easier to see, we're going to bring a small table up front. I don't want to set them right on the stage. If they're on a table, I think they'll be a little easier for you all to see.
How's that? Is that going to be enough room? It's to turn it off or just turn it off?
Thank you very
do it
much,
once.
Larry. Great to see you. Say hi to everyone.